संस्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णो वन्दे जगद्गुरुम्। Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to be here. This is my last talk here in South Africa. I'll be flying back to Hollywood tomorrow. I'd like to thank Revered Swami Medhanandaji Maharaj for inviting me and hosting me here for the whole time. My pranams to Maharaj and my pranams to Revered Swami Chandikanandaji Maharaj as well, and my namaskars to all of you. Thank you so much for making my time here so enjoyable, and I hope we all benefited from this brief time that I had here. I wanted to talk today about a topic that's very close to my heart because it involves two things that I love. One is Sharam Krishna, the other is the Bhagavad Gita. And because it's Krishna Ashtami, I thought this would be a very appropriate topic. So we'll be looking briefly, in just about a half hour, at the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Some of you might know that I've been teaching a class called Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. It's been going on for 1.5 or 2 years now. You can find them on YouTube, and you can find them all organized on my website, swamimedhananda.com. So we've already had about 60 classes, something like that. So you can catch up. We just finished chapter 6 of the Gita, so we have 12 chapters remaining. It's a very important project, looking at Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. And frankly, we haven't made all that much progress yet, which might be surprising. But if you think about it, our tradition is not that old. Sri Ramakrishna left his body in 1886, Swamiji in 1902. The order is just a little over 100 years old. And we don't yet have Prasthana Traya Bhashyas from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. What do I mean? See, to be a bona fide Vedantic spiritual tradition, you need to write commentaries on at least the Brahma Sutra, and ideally also the Bhagavad Gita and at least some of the Upanishads. Without that, from a traditional standpoint, you cannot establish yourself as a distinct Vedantic spiritual tradition. And our tradition doesn't have it yet. If you look at other traditions, like ISKCON, Prabhupada has given his commentary on the Gita, for instance. Look at Swami Narayan. It has a strong presence in South Africa. A few decades ago, one of the monks of Swami Narayan wrote commentaries in Sanskrit on the Prasthana Traya, on the Upanishads, on Bhagavad Gita, on the Brahma Sutra. We don't have it yet. You might be wondering, well, why do we need it in the first place? Well, because Swamiji said it was absolutely essential. Let me read to you something that Swamiji said. Swami Vivekananda said, "We must interpret the Vedas in the light of the experience of Sri Ramakrishna. Shankaracharya and all other commentators made the tremendous mistake to think that the whole of the Vedas say only one thing. Therefore, they were guilty of torturing those of the apparently conflicting Vedic texts which go against their own doctrines into the meaning of their particular schools. As in the olden times, it was the Lord alone, the deliverer of the Gita, who partially harmonized these apparently conflicting statements. So, with the view to completely settling this dispute, immensely magnified in the process of time, he himself has come as Sri Ramakrishna." We talked yesterday, I think, about how Sri Ramakrishna's statement to Naren, "He who was Rama in Krishna is now Ramakrishna in this body." Swamiji is explaining this in the context of the Gita. What God came to do in the form of Sri Krishna, the deliverer of the Gita, who partially harmonized the different conflicting yogas and spiritual philosophies, God came again in the 19th century in the form of Sri Ramakrishna to finish the job. So now let me continue Swamiji's statement. Therefore, no one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedanta unless one studies them in the light of the utterance of Sri Ramakrishna. Very strong words, very bold words. And we have yet to follow them, frankly. We have not yet produced commentaries in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. God willing, maybe I'll be able to do some part of that task. I'm not sure what Thakur has in mind. Sri Ramakrishna loved the Gita. If you look at the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, he talks about the Gita all the time. And he said, what is the significance of the Gita? It is what you find by repeating the word 10 times. It is then reversed into Tagi. Gita, 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 Gita. It becomes Tyagi. Which means a person who has renounced everything for God. And the lesson of the Gita is, O man, renounce everything and seek God alone. In another part of the Gospel, so many people know that teaching of Sri Ramakrishna's, in another part of the Gospel, he actually says, he says, even if a sannyasi owns nothing else and carries nothing else with him, the sannyasi should have a little pocket edition of the Gita. He says that in the Bangla. So he held the Bhagavad Gita in very high regard. And it's not a coincidence, because as Swamiji said, it was God in the form of Sri Ramakrishna who was the same Krishna who gave us the teachings of the Gita. So it's a wonderful scripture. And yet, if we rely blindly on any of the traditional commentaries, we are going to be led astray. It's not something that I'm telling you. Swami Vivekananda himself said it. He used very strong language sometimes. It may hurt the ears to hear it, but he says it. And I don't think we should be like ostriches with our heads in the sand, pretending that he didn't say it. He said it. Swami Vivekananda said many things. He said, at times, Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, and the other traditional commentators were conscious liars. He used this language. They were at times conscious liars. Why did he use such strong language? Because he saw that in his time, even now, it's the same situation, frankly, in the late 19th century, under British colonial rule, that Indians had this very slavish mentality. Oh, we follow tradition, we obey tradition. Swamiji didn't like that. He was a critical thinker, and he said that this clinging to tradition uncritically and dogmatically is part of India's problem. And that we need to be bold. And that if God has come again in the form of Sri Ramakrishna, he didn't come just to pour the same old wine into new bottles, to say the same thing that has been said 100 times before. There has to be something new in the message of Sri Ramakrishna. What was that message? And how can it help us in our spiritual life? How can it help us to reinterpret these great Vedantic scriptures? This is why we need to reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures. Now, let me begin to make a case in the little time I have as to how we can start to reinterpret the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, just giving a few examples. Let's talk about the 4 main spiritual practices in Vedanta, the 4 yogas. We all know them. Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, right? Raja Yoga or Dhyana Yoga, these are 2 synonymous terms. What's discussed in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, Dhyana Yoga. Now, if you look at the traditional schools of Vedanta, you'll begin to understand why Swamiji says we should not blindly rely on these traditional Vedantic approaches. Why? I think one of the main reasons is this. If you study carefully, a lot of people talk about Shankara, almost nobody reads Shankara. A lot of people talk about Ramanuja, almost nobody reads Ramanuja. But if you read the text, what you'll find is that all of these traditional Vedantic schools, they privilege one yoga over the others. They say that one yoga and one yoga alone leads directly to the highest goal of liberation. The other ones, they don't lead. They're lower disciplines. They're in some way preparatory, but they don't take you directly to the highest goal. So according to Shankara, what is that highest yoga? The path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. According to Bhakti schools of Vedanta, the hint is already in the name, obviously, the highest yoga is Bhakti Yoga, right? So Ramanuja says Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Madhva says Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Chaitanya school says Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Vallabha school, Vaishnava school also says Bhakti Yoga is the highest. Now you might ask, what does the Bhagavad Gita say? What does Sri Krishna say? Now, if you rely on Shankara's commentary, if you look at Shankara's interpretation of the Gita, what are you going to find? That means when you read the Gita, you have the text of Gita, you're putting on the Shankara glasses, okay? And when you read the Bhagavad Gita with the Shankara glasses, what does the Gita tell you about the 4 yogas? It tells us exactly what Shankara tells us, which is that Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge alone, can lead to liberation. Now, let's take off those glasses, and let's put on the Ramanuja glasses. And now let's read the same Gita. Now what is the Gita telling us suddenly? That Bhakti Yoga is the highest yoga, and that it leads directly to liberation, not the path of knowledge. What Swamiji wanted us to do, what he wants us to do, is to remove all the glasses. Let's remove the glasses. And now, let's put on a new pair of glasses, the glasses of Sri Ramakrishna, the Ramakrishna glasses. Now, when we put on these Ramakrishna glasses, the text appears in a very different light. Now, what does the Bhagavad Gita tell us about the 4 yogas? That each of the 4 yogas are direct and independent paths to liberation. This is a radically different teaching. I hope you're beginning to see why it's so important to remove the Shankara glasses and the Ramanuja glasses we have to put on the Ramakrishna glasses. Now you might ask, there could be a subtle objection here. The objection would be, why don't we just remove all the glasses? Why do we have to put on the Ramakrishna glasses? The idea is, of course, the ideal is you remove all the glasses. Wearing these glasses helps us to see what's really in the scripture, what's really in the Gita. Why? Because anybody who studied the Gita will know that its main emphasis is harmonizing. Bhagavan Krishna is constantly harmonizing the yogas. Chapter 5, Sankhya Yoga, Pratagbalaha, Pravadantina Panditaha. Fools alone say that the path of Sankhya, which means the path of knowledge, and the path of Karma Yoga are different. In fact, they lead to the same goal. This is exactly Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. So again and again, Bhagavan Krishna is trying to harmonize the different yogas, the different spiritual philosophies, and so on. Therefore, it stands to reason that if you study the scripture in the light of the greatest Samanvaya avatara of all time, meaning Sri Ramakrishna, the avatara of harmony, the one who harmonized all the different spiritual attitudes, the one who harmonized all of the world religions, the one who harmonized all of the different yogas and spiritual disciplines in religious traditions within Hinduism and outside of Hinduism. By interpreting the scripture in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, we can better understand that harmonizing impulse at the heart of the Bhagavad Gita. Okay? I'll just give you a couple examples now. Chapter 3. Verse 20 of the Bhagavad Gita. It's a wonderful shloka. Karmanaiva hi samsiddhim astita janakadayaha loka sangramevapi sampashyan kartumarhasi. What does the verse mean? Through karma eva, karmana eva, through karma alone, through work alone, King Janaka and others attained perfection. And therefore you, O Arjuna, should work for the good of the world, keeping in mind the example of Bhagavan Krishna himself. This is what the verse says. Now, if you look at Shankara's commentary, what does Shankara say? You shouldn't take it literally. Let's not get carried away here. Through karma alone, King Janaka purified his mind, and then he stopped karma yoga, and then he practiced jnana yoga, and then he realized the highest goal. Now, I think this is a good example of what Swamiji meant when he said that the traditional acharyas sometimes had to torture the scriptures to suit their own philosophy. Because there's no mention here of karma yoga being a preparatory discipline, that it's only meant to purify the mind, that you then have to practice the path of knowledge, and then you realize liberation. Where does it say this? It doesn't say it. But Shankara has to bring it in. Why? Because he's trying to show that the whole scripture supports his philosophy. Right? That's why Swamiji said we should not blindly rely on any of these commentators. That doesn't mean that Shankara's commentary is useless. No, there's a tremendous amount to learn from Shankara's commentaries. There's a tremendous amount to learn from all of the traditional commentaries, Ramanuja's commentaries. So what I'm trying to do in my class, the Bhagavad Gita and the light of Sri Ramakrishna, is I'm drawing on Shankara's commentary, and Ramanuja's commentary, and Sri Aurobindo's commentary, and Swami Tapasanji's commentary, many commentaries. And then we can try to get at the original meaning, the original import of these verses from the scriptures. By the way, there is no official commentary on the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, but we have some helps. What are some of those helps? Swami Chidbhavananda has published a commentary on the Gita where he links the different verses in the Gita to some teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So he's gone some way in the direction of producing a commentary. It's not a complete job. I think it can be improved in many ways. That's my opinion. So I don't actually rely on it much because I find it overall fairly superficial. But there are two other books I would recommend. One is Swami Tapasenandaji's book on the Bhagavad Gita called Bhagavad Gita, the Scripture of Mankind. That's a very nice book. He's a very scholarly monk and a great spiritual aspirant also. The only limitation with that book is he doesn't give a full commentary. What he gives are notes on selected verses, but he doesn't give a running commentary on all 700 verses. So that's the limitation, but we can learn a lot from reading Swami Tapasenandaji's commentary. And then third, this is the main textbook that I use in my class on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. Many people don't know the extent to which Sri Aurobindo was strongly influenced by both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Strongly influenced. To the point where in a letter around 1910, 1912, he said, remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna. And he was strongly influenced by Ramakrishna's teachings, especially Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vigana, the Ishvara Koti, and so on. And so in his commentary on the Gita, he has a big 600-page commentary on the Gita called Essays on the Gita. He actually does reinterpret the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. But we have to read between the lines because he doesn't mention Sri Ramakrishna explicitly anywhere in the text. So those of us who have background knowledge about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings will then need to correlate Sri Ramakrishna's teachings with how Sri Aurobindo interprets the terms jnana and vijnana in the Gita, for instance, and so on. Okay? So that's what I'm trying to do in this course. And fortunately, I'm blessed to have some brilliant students, both in person and throughout the world, people are following. You can also follow if you want, because they're live streamed on YouTube, and they're all archived on my website, so you can look at it. And I give homework assignments with study questions. You can answer them by filling out these Google forms. So I recommend that you join if you're interested. Now, one of these other big perennial questions, which is greater, Bhakti Yoga or Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge or the path of devotion? Different Vedantic schools, saints have been fighting about this for centuries without resolution. Chapter 12 of the Gita. Arjuna point blank asks Krishna this question. Just Tata yukta ye bhaktas tvam paryupasate ye chapyaksharam avyaktam tesham ke yoga vittamaha. Who are the greater knowers of yoga? Yoga vittamaha. Those who worship and love you, O Krishna, or those who meditate on the impersonal Brahman, the impersonal Akshara Brahman? He's directly asking this question that comes up in the gospel many times. This is what Arjuna is asking Krishna. Now, in the next verse, Krishna gives a direct answer. Maya veshya mano ye mam nitya yukta upasate shraddhaya parayo petas te me yuktata mamataha. Now, what is Krishna saying? Those who worship me with absolute faith, with their minds fixed intently on me, with steadfast love, I consider to be the most perfect in yoga. Arjuna asks a direct question. Sri Krishna seems to give a direct answer. What's his answer? Which path is greater, Bhakti Yoga or Jnana Yoga? You tell me. Bhakti Yoga seems pretty obvious. But if you look at Shankara's commentary, not so obvious. Because that's a scandal to Shankara. It cannot be true. So he cannot take this verse at face value. So he has to do a lot of gymnastics here. And Shankara says, look, it may seem as if Krishna is saying that Bhakti Yoga is a higher path, but that's because he's not considering Jnana Yoga in this verse. He takes for granted that Jnana Yoga is the highest path, and then he says to Arjuna, because he's an inferior spiritual aspirant, but Bhakti Yoga is good too, and he gives him a nice pat on the head. Roughly, I'm just paraphrasing. But this is how Shankara handles this verse. It gets very tricky for Shankara. There are a number of other places in the scriptures where Shankara is in big trouble. I'll give you another example. Isha Upanishad, beautiful short scripture. Second verse of the Isha Upanishad. Mantra is Kuruvan neveha karma ani jiji vishetshatagasama, which means one should strive to live for 100 years, continually engaging in action, never stopping from acting, for the good of mankind, for the good of humanity. Now, this directly contradicts Shankara's philosophy. So what does Shankara say? He says this second mantra is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants. So this is one of the tricks in Shankara's toolkit. He brings in this distinction between Manda Adhikaris, inferior spiritual aspirants, and superior spiritual aspirants. Anytime it's convenient, he'll say, this verse is meant for inferior aspirants, or this is meant for superior aspirants. This is one way. Now, you might ask, how does Swamiji interpret this verse? Swami Vivekananda has given us a beautiful commentary on many of the verses of the Isha Upanishad in one of his lectures delivered in London in 1896 called God in Everything. Most of us don't even realize that Swami Vivekananda has given us commentaries on many scriptural verses from the Gita, from the Isha Upanishad. And there, in the second verse, Swamiji, he doesn't accept Shankara's reading here. He doesn't say that the second verse is meant for Manda Adhikaris, that it's meant for inferior spiritual aspirants. So he's practicing what he's preaching. He says that we should reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. He begins to do that. And he says this verse is meant for everybody. It's even meant for realized souls, for Jivan Muktas, for avatars. Look at Bhagavan Krishna himself. Bhagavan Krishna continued to work throughout his life for the good of humanity. And Vigyanis, what Sri Ramakrishna called Vigyanis, they do the same thing. They work for the welfare of humanity. Karma Yoga is not a preparatory discipline. One should engage in karma for one's entire life, but it should be nishkama karma. Nishkama karma, which means desireless karma, unselfish karma. And finally, I want to mention, I think one of the most exciting areas in which we can reinterpret, or one of the most exciting ways that we can radically reinterpret the Bhagavad Gita's teachings in the light of Sri Ramakrishna is with respect to the terms Jnana and Vigyana. These are terms that come up in the Bhagavad Gita 5 times. The pairs of terms. These two terms are paired, Jnana and Vigyana, 5 times. What are those 5 times? 3.41, 6.8, 7.2, 9.1, and 18.42. At all 5 of these places in the Gita, these 2 terms are used. Bhagavan Krishna says Jnana and then followed by Vigyana. Of course, there's this big question, what do these terms mean? What do these terms mean? And now if you look at the commentaries, each commentator is giving a different answer to the question. Each one. Shankara gives one answer, Ramanuja gives another answer, and it goes on like that. Now, I would say that Shankara's interpretation is the most popular one. What is his interpretation? He says, when these 2 terms are paired, Jnana with Vigyana, we should understand that Jnana is not the highest spiritual knowledge. It can't be, because then there's Vigyana after that. So he says, when Jnana is paired with Vigyana, we have to take Jnana to mean mere intellectual knowledge of the highest reality. Just reading the scriptures and understanding intellectually what the Atman is, or what God is. And then Vigyana is direct experiential realization of the Atman. So it's a difference between mere scriptural knowledge, which is Jnana, and Anubhuti, direct spiritual experience, which is Vigyana. Most people, if you ask them, what do the terms Jnana and Vigyana mean in the Gita? They'll give you this answer. Now, the exciting thing is, Sri Ramakrishna gives us a completely different way of understanding these terms Jnana and Vigyana, which I would argue, and I'm not the first to argue this, Swami Tapasanji has made this argument, and Sri Aurobindo has also made this argument, that it's a much better interpretation of the terms Jnana and Vigyana because it fits better in the general context. in the overall context of all 700 verses in the Gita. And I can't make the case here, but I want to just begin to explain, what is this new interpretation of Jnana and Vigyana in the Gita? Well, we have to know what Sri Ramakrishna meant by Jnana and Vigyana. What did he say? He said, if you imagine a building, and there's a staircase leading up to the roof. And he says, you have to climb up the staircase to get to the roof. He likens that process of climbing up the staircase to neti vichara. He's not this, Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not this mind, Brahman is not my body, and so on, until you reach the roof. The roof is jnana. Reaching the roof is jnana. Knowledge of non-dual Brahman in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. You realize your true nature as impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. And if you come back to the world, you feel that this world is a dream, an illusion. Sri Ramakrishna would say, dhokar tati, a framework of illusion. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. This is Shankara's philosophy. But Sri Ramakrishna doesn't end there. He then says, but the Vigyani, after reaching the roof, will look back on the same staircase and say, wait a minute, the staircase is made of the same things as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. The Vigyani, Sri Ramakrishna says, realizes that that divine reality which is nirguna, impersonal, attributeless, is also saguna, the personal God, Shakti. And instead of looking upon this world as a dream, as an illusion, the Vigyani sees it as mojarkuti, as a mansion of mirth, as a mart of joy. Why? Because he sees nothing but God. All the names and forms in the world are blissful manifestations of the same divine. So this is Vigyana. Now, coming back to the Gita, how do we interpret the terms Jnana and Vigyana? Both Swami Tapasanandaji and Sri Aurobindo interpret the terms Jnana and Vigyana in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Very beautifully. They say that when Bhagavan Krishna talks about Jnana, when he's pairing the terms Jnana and Vigyana, he means the essential knowledge of the non-dual self. This is what Sri Ramakrishna calls reaching the roof in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But that's not the summit of spiritual experience. It's not the end of spiritual life. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Jnana pore Vigyan, which means after Jnana comes Vigyana. Some great souls can go beyond Jnana to attain Vigyana. And this is what Bhagavan Krishna is talking about. That some great souls can go on beyond just the realization of the non-dual self to a more expansive, what Sri Aurobindo calls a more integral knowledge, a more comprehensive knowledge of the divine, not just as Nirguna Brahman, but also as Shakti, as Saguna Brahman. It's what Sri Aurobindo calls the Purushottama. The term Purushottama comes up in chapter 15 of the Bhagavad Gita. You should know that there are three Purushas: Kshara Purusha, Akshara Purusha, and Purushottama. And Sri Aurobindo says this Purushottama that Bhagavan Krishna talks about in chapter 15 of the Gita is what Sri Ramakrishna calls this infinite, impersonal, personal divine reality. What's the evidence? Because in chapter 15, Krishna says, Aksharadapi chottamaha, I am greater even than the Akshara. This is a remarkable statement. He's greater even than Brahman, than the Akshara Brahman. So Sri Aurobindo is able to explain that very nicely in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Because the divine is both impersonal and personal. Now, how does this help us to interpret the verse in the Gita? I want to give you just one example and then we'll conclude. Verse 7.3, okay? Verse 7.3 of the Gita, another famous verse. Manushanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhaye yatatamapi siddhanam kaschin mam veti tatvataha. Okay, now I can give a translation, but the problem is the translation itself is an interpretation. Every translation is also an interpretation. So now I have to explain it this way. First, how does Shankara interpret this verse? Okay, what he says is, well, I have to explain the plain meaning first. It gets complicated. Manushanam sahasreshu, it means among hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, simple. Kaschid yatati siddhaye, only a few of them strive for siddhi, for spiritual perfection, for the highest spiritual goal, moksha. That's a simple line. Nobody disagrees about what that means. But the second line is where it gets complicated. Yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tatvataha. Yatatam, among those striving. Api siddhanam, this is where it gets very tricky. among those who are striving, those few, among the hundreds of thousands who are striving for perfection, who have attained siddhi, yatatam api siddhanam, because it's mentioned specifically, they're siddhas. Those yatatas, those people who are engaged in spiritual practice, who attain siddhi, api siddhanam, even among those, kaschin mam veti tatvataha. Even among those few people who have strived for perfection and finally attained siddhi, perfection, only a few attain me, says Krishna. Kaschin mam veti tatvataha. So the plain meaning of the verse is, there are like three categories. There's the huge mass of people, 7 billion people in the world. Only a tiny minority of them are spiritual aspirants. Right? Manushanam sasvij kaschid yatati siddhaye. Now, even in that smaller subcategory of people who are spiritual aspirants, yatatam api siddhanam, only a tiny minority of them attain perfection. Actually, there are 4 categories then now. There's all the people, then there's a second category of spiritual aspirants. Among those spiritual aspirants who are working hard, only a few attain siddhi, perfection. And then there's a 4th category. Even among those siddhas, only a few attain Krishna. This is very interesting. If you just look at the plain meaning of the verse, the plain meaning. What does Krishna mean? What does it mean? What does it mean to attain Krishna separately from attaining perfection? How can it be beyond perfection? So what Sri Aurobindo suggests is that this 3rd category of people who have attained perfection, they've realized the non-dual self. They've reached the roof. But there's an even greater perfection. There's an even greater spiritual knowledge, which is attaining me, meaning Krishna. In what sense? Knowledge of the Purushottama. Knowledge that the divine is not just Nirguna but also Saguna. Knowledge that Vasudeva Sarvamiti, Samahatma Sudurlabha, chapter 7 of the Gita, that there's nothing but Vasudeva in this entire universe. That knowledge that the impersonal, personal Purushottama manifests as everything in the universe, this is the highest and greatest spiritual knowledge. Even among the perfected souls, only a few attain that highest knowledge. Exactly like that, Sri Ramakrishna says, ordinary souls, at best they can attain jnana, but then they have to leave their body within 21 days in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. Only a few Ishvara kotis, typically, these divinely commissioned souls, can come back from the state of samadhi to attain the state of Vigyana and have a more intimate knowledge of God. Sri Ramakrishna says, a more intimate knowledge. You can talk with God. You feel that God is your nearest and dearest. And you realize that God is not only the non-dual self, but also Shakti, Divine Mother. And that you see nothing but God. That's why Sri Ramakrishna used to say, why should I see God only with my eyes closed? Can't I see God with my eyes open also? That's the Vigyani. Thank you. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.